The world will remember April 7th of this year for a long time. Some called it a day of liberation, others the antics of an obsessed old man in power. But for many, April 7th became Black Monday. Wall Street is on fire. Markets around the world are collapsing in a matter of minutes. People's money that they have been saving for years is literally evaporating before their eyes. And all because Donald Trump officially dropped the long-prepared bomb: trade tariffs for countries around the world. What was their reaction? Well, some are just developing countermeasures. And of course, China immediately imposed mirror duties on goods from the U.S. Trump didn't wait and turned up the heat. Now everything coming into the U.S. from China is subject to a tariff of 125%. And the U.S. president doesn't seem to be stopping. Experts are already predicting a new global economic crisis for the whole world, comparable to the one in 2008. Why did Trump do this? Is he really so ignorant of economics? Or has some kind of traitor slipped into his advisors who wants to set him up this way? Or is the U.S. president actually playing a much more complex game than it seems? Let's figure it out. So, the U.S. is now officially pursuing one of the most aggressive economic policies in human history. Since Donald Trump's new decree, all countries in the world are supplying their goods too. America with a 10% surcharge. Well, that's not much, you might think, but it's just the beginning. 10% is the minimum that some lucky ones like Armenia, Ukraine, or Georgia got. But most weren't so lucky. How about 49% for Cambodia? 20% for the European Union? Or 24% for Japan? So, well, it's clear. But why all this? To demonstrate their power? But everyone already knows about it. To scare the others and humiliate them? Well, maybe just a little bit. Those who support Trump's decision to impose tariffs cite two main reasons: restoring American industry and protecting national security. Opponents and critics, on the other hand, warn of inevitable price increases and global economic consequences. As usual, everyone is right. But here's what both critics and fans of Trump's decision are missing. These tariffs can slow down the U.S. economy so much that the Fed will be forced to lower interest rates to save it. And this measure will allow Americans to refinance their constantly growing debt and then throw a victory party in the markets. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Then let's go in order. A couple of weeks before Trump announced his tariffs, the market situation was quite positive. People were excited and hoping for positive changes. But as soon as the tariffs were introduced, the stock market fell by about 10% from its peak. And the day after that, it lost $2.5 trillion. And now there is no talk of any positive expectations. The markets fear a recession, and it is quite possible. The system is suffering from an enormous amount of stress. Falling stocks, the situation in credit markets, currency fluctuations. Look at the trade-sensitive Canadian dollar, Chinese yuan, or Mexican peso. It all comes down to the fact that the whole world literally depends on the actions of the U.S. right now. The main financial centers of the planet are frozen in fear. Interested business groups, politicians, and even some of Trump's advisors are trying to persuade him to cancel or at least soften his decision. As the U.S. president himself said, and I quote, "They kiss my ass." They're dying to make a deal. For these very negotiating countries, Trump was generous and introduced a 90-day delay to discuss the terms. But the basic 10% tariff will apply to everyone. In short, it's clear that everyone is in despair and no one knows what to expect next. That's why the global economy is entering a zone of turbulence, and no one can predict when it will end, if at all. Why did this happen? Well, because these tariffs are just too extreme. The U.S. administration itself called them equivalent, as if we're charging each country exactly the same as they charge us. And Trump also added that he even softened the tariffs by half, because Americans are kind of good guys. But this is absolutely not true. Here's an example. The U.S. table says that China's average tariff on goods from the U.S. is 67%. But in reality, it is in the range of 6 to 10%. Or here's Kazakhstan. Donald Trump demonstrated that Kazakhs levy a 54% duty on American goods. So he assigned them a retaliatory tariff of 27%, half. But according to WTO data, the average tariff on U.S. goods in Kazakhstan is 5%. So, you can tell a similar story about almost every country on Trump's list. By the way, Russia and Belarus didn't make it to the list, which angered representatives of some countries. But it's all simple. The U.S. hardly has any trade with Russia and Belarus. And while Trump is negotiating with Putin, he doesn't want to get the tariff issue involved in their negotiations as well. Let's go back to those who made it to the list. Where did the Americans get these figures from? And by what formula did they calculate the tariffs? Guys from the internet have already figured it all out. And it turned out that it's not that complicated. So here's a tutorial on how to calculate tariff plans for all your trading partners. Take the U.S. trade deficit with the country of interest. Let's take China. In 2024, the U.S. trade deficit with it was $294.4 billion. Then we look at imports from China. Here we have $439.9 billion for the same period. Divide the first number by the second and get our result of 67%. And out of the sheer kindness of the American soul, we divide by 2 and get a new tariff for Comrade Xi of 33.5%. We round it up to 34, because American kindness is, of course, boundless. But you also shouldn't get too greedy, of course. Then, in the course of an economic shootout with the Chinese, Trump ramped these 34 up to 125%. But here, no formulas were needed. Whatever figure the president writes, that's how it will be now. Even 1,000,000,000%. That's it. The formula is the same for the other countries. You can pause the video and recalculate it yourself. The scheme raises some questions. Yes, but you don't know about one aspect that the creators of this formula overlooked. We're talking about the service sector, tourism, education, the financial sector. All those things that the U.S. exports in much greater volume than it imports. But all this was ignored in the calculations. They only counted the goods that, so to say, can be touched by hand. You've probably already read discussions of internet experts or listened to conversations of economists about how Trump is just a fool who doesn't understand what he's doing. With his own hands, he's making goods less accessible to Americans, collapsing global markets and strangling producers, who are now forced to pay several times more for conditional cocoa or wooden boards. But there are also those who see meaning in Trump's actions. Only 8 days after the collapse did the Fed begin to pursue a stimulative policy, and almost a month later began to print money without restrictions. Perhaps this time, too, Trump will have to wait some time before the Fed makes its move and gives him what he so wants: a working printing press and low rates. As soon as he gets this, he will probably soften or even cancel the duties. Otherwise, inflation in the U.S. will accelerate, and this will benefit no one. Let's give the floor to our economist, Dennis Ilikovsky. Yes, the fact that Trump staged this shock for the sake of the flight of investors to use government bonds, as a result of which their yields will decrease and the public debt can be refinanced at a more favorable rate, is one of the popular theories explaining the motives of the U.S. president's actions. But there are other versions as well. For example, the fiscal reason. The U.S. lives with a budget deficit of more than 6% of GDP. Last year, spending exceeded revenue by almost $2 trillion. But Trump promised to cut taxes. How to do this? You can raise import duties and use these revenues to reduce the tax burden on Americans. Industrial policy. Since the late 80s, American companies have moved many factories and plants abroad. This led to lower prices for American consumers, but increased America's dependence on international trade. And in the context of growing geopolitical differences, this is fraught with problems with self-sufficiency in many basic industrial goods. And the longer you put off solving this problem, the more industrial skills the U.S. will lose. We know this logic under the term import substitution, and therefore we understand well that even if we start producing more at home, it will most likely be of lower quality and more expensive. But at least our own. This decision may also have political, not economic interests, directed both inward, to support his core electorate who have suffered from globalization, and outward. The reduction in the import tariff rates, announced by Trump on Liberation Day, could become a powerful lever in negotiations with other countries. But in any case, no matter how rational Trump's motives may be, the way it was done so far looks very much like a rough improvisation. And the markets were rather frightened not by the duties themselves, but by the style and structure of decision-making in the White House, although the duties themselves do not promise anything good for the economy, either. Just a month before Liberation Day, a video about the history of U.S. trade wars was released on my channel, and it, to be honest, does not promise Trump an easy victory. You can watch it by following the link in the description. So, if everything goes according to Trump's plan, remember that we don't know for sure if it exists. The markets will continue to fall in the next month and a half. Then the Fed's measures will start to work. And by summer-fall, inflation will slow down and there will be growth in the markets. The trade war in its harsh phase will end. The debt will be refinanced. America will become a leader with new jobs and growing production. In favor of the truthfulness of this theory, even the legendary investor and founder of the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater, Ray Dalio, spoke out. Here's one of his tweets. At the moment, a lot of attention is rightly being paid to the recently announced tariffs and their significant impact on markets and the economy. But very little attention is being paid to the circumstances that caused them, and even greater disruptions that are likely still to come. Further, he, of course, states that such Trump's policy will reduce the efficiency of the global economy, which is facing difficult times. In the end, it can lead to stagflation, which is harmful for most countries in the world, but beneficial for the U.S. if the Fed responds with easing of monetary policy. It is obvious that in a world where deglobalization is taking place, where major players cannot be sure that other major players will not refuse the goods they need, which worries Americans, or will not pay them the money they are owed, which worries the Chinese, the presence of a large trade and financial imbalance seems inappropriate. Here's another tweet from Dalio to confirm this. So, keeping this idea in mind and the fact that Trump understands well the importance of refinancing and low rates, we come to this scheme. Trump imposes tariffs. The economy slows down. A recession approaches. The Fed lowers rates and prints more money. Trump refinances the U.S. debt. And potentially, the U.S. reindustrializes. Now, Trump's actions make much more sense. Yes, in a world disillusioned with globalization, a new scheme seems to be emerging. Every man for himself. And the U.S. president decided to act radically, using a tough survival tactic. Minimal dependence on anyone. Restoration of domestic production, and ensuring the status of the dollar as the strongest world currency. The system has long needed a reboot, and Trump decided to hurt himself. That is, his entire country now, in order to win in the long run. Whether he succeeds or not, we'll find out soon. I want to end with the words of the same Mr. Dalio. We are witnessing not just another market volatility, but the beginning of the collapse of the familiar world order.